So I recently did the video talking about the death of Superman with Joe Colaro. Great video. If you haven't seen it, it's long, but it's a good video. What I like most is certainly not the parts where I'm talking, but the the parts with the news reports are they're it's just amazing to see those kind of how the news used to cover this stuff back in the 90s. When did the 90s start to really feel like the 80s? I'm not sure. Anyway, but somebody watched that and brought up a good question, which was, what other events in comics have actually made the news? When did we get national news coverage for things in comics? Well, let's go into it. Hey, everybody, this is Perch. Going into what things in comics actually made the news. And there's not that many, although I'm 99% sure I'm going to forget some. So you're probably going to help me out in the comments a lot by telling me what I forgot and the other things that actually made national news. But before I get into it, hey, I'm supposed to do it at the beginning, so I might as well. Why don't you like and subscribe, or dislike and unsubscribe? That is also a choice. You can do both of those things one handy kind of way. One note: if you thought you subscribed in the past, you may not anymore. Who knew? So you might want to get back on that, or at least check to make sure YouTube didn't say do something silly. But we're talking about news events in comics, where or comics that became news events that crossed over to become national news. Now, obviously, the death of Superman was one of those. The death of Superman did make the national news and did have quite a big uproar. And I think, and I may be wrong about this, but I believe that was the biggest. I think that moment was probably the largest case where you had kind of national news highlighting an event like that. Another one that is similar was the death of Captain America. So weirdly, this one was handled strange. If you remember, we had Civil War, that event, and Iron Man versus Captain America. And it was kind of the first, we've had heroes fighting heroes before tons of times. I mean, to the point that it's kind of a trope of comics that, hey, there's a villain doing something shady, and then the heroes show up, and the hero, oh, big misunderstanding. And then, so they fight, and then they realize, oh, we got tricked, and then they go after the villain together. I mean, that was kind of the plot of the Avengers #1, for that matter, as well as tons of comics. But Civil War itself didn't get that much attention, but the death of Captain America did. And if you remember that event, Captain America dies in his own book, kind of after the fact, and the death of the American dream. And I think that's probably why it got the coverage it did, because you had this great visual of leading Captain America on the steps of something, and he's in a suit, and we can kind of see America, and it's like the death of America, and that was definitely one of those moments that got national news. Not as much as the death of Superman. I think the national news, for whatever reason, the news seemed to come to the conclusion that Superman was actually going to stay dead. I'm not sure why exactly this happened this time, but and maybe in some ways it played into kind of stories the news wanted to tell anyway. Like Superman's a bit old fashioned, and so it makes sense that DC would want to retire him, so they're killing him off and everything else. And I also remember that the news kind of bought from some of the writers in DC at the time that no, he's not a dream, not a hoax, not an imaginary story. He's actually going to be dead. And I just remember a lot of news stations being kind of pissy about it later when it was revealed he was not. So when Captain America's coverage did come around, it didn't have the same impact, and the news was skeptical at that point. It's like, but he probably will return. A lot of more referencing that Superman thing. Like, you're not going to get us twice. The other event that got national news was the marriage. It's kind of two things. It tends to be death or marriage. Those tend to be the two. So Spider-Man marrying Mary Jane was another one that got national news. There were newspapers about it. I remember, I don't know if it was Time or Newsweek. It was one of the bigger magazines, like had that on the cover, like they're getting married, Spider-Man and Mary Jane, and that was a big deal. And in fact, there again, I think that it's when at times I've heard people from Marvel express confusion as to why fans are still upset over Spider-Man and Mary Jane not being married over One More Day. Now, One More Day is, several years removed at this point, and yet there's still fans angry about it. And Marvel doesn't. It's like, God, can't they get over it at this point? Well, sure. I mean, you can't really tell people to get over things, but one of the reasons is that one, it lasted for a long time. It was national news. There are a lot of people who were kids, who just started collecting comics, and the wedding of Spider-Man and Mary Jane, and there were multiple covers, if you can believe that. In the '80s, there are actually different covers of the various wedding attire that went out, and it stuck in people's heads as a big moment for comics. It's Spider-Man getting married. He's getting married to a super hot model too. I mean, hey, he's doing okay for himself. That Parker luck has turned around. So that was a big one. I remember the news stations they were covering like that Spider Man's getting married, and like little bits like, when are we getting to get some spider babies, because that's the big follow up question. Um, and then to similar along the marriage theme, when Batman was supposed to get married to Catwoman with issue 50, and this may be where DC misjudged what was going to happen, because both DC and Marvel send out press releases. They usually get a kind of a fluff article in the Atlantic or USA Today or somewhere around these characters, and they don't often get much hookup. They get like they don't cross over into the news. They don't usually cross over into anything else. But this is one of those cases where it did. So they released the Batman Catwoman wedding, and it got picked up by the national news. It was on a lot of evening. Batman's finally getting married after years of being a swinging bachelor. Batman is finally tying the knot with his one-time enemy turned lover, Catwoman. I don't know why I'm saying that like a 1950s prospector, but anyway. So he prospect? No, that's not what that accent was. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Um, that was another one that got a lot, and I think they're kind of like the same thing with Spider-Man, only of course much faster. That's where you had more irritation with DC and with Tom King for promoting something that they knew wasn't going to happen. And in this one, I really have to blame, and I think Tom King, who then proceeded kind of right after that to go to San Diego Comic Con and hire a bodyguard to protect him, but the bodyguard turned out to be a buddy, and it was all kind of a weird stunt. Those things, that whole chain of events, is why a lot of people are pissed at Tom King and dislike him. And so every now and then I'm talking to somebody in comics, like, I don't know why people are upset with Tom King. He's a charming fellow. And it's like, well, there's these two things that seem that got people a little irritated. That's probably why. Now, reportedly Tom King got a lot of death threats and all that. None of this stuff warrants a death threat, but or anywhere close to that. But it's like this is where this stuff doesn't just appear out of thin air. This is where a lot of this stuff came from. Other than that, comics in the news tended to be less events and more kind of mistakes or things that could be special interest stories. When Image was launched, it didn't really get news attention, but it did get a lot of nighttime talk show attention. There was a whole bit with Dennis Miller interviewing Rob Liefeld, and you had this kind of, I think the talk shows were, I don't know. They're trying to make it out like the Beatles of comics were forming, so there was a little bit of that, but I didn't really necessarily take. But that got some attention outside of comics. Other than that, then you get the little kind of outrage things. So I did the video a couple weeks ago, or I don't know, at some point in the past, about Superman being renouncing America. That got some brief news attention. There was the Bat Penis that got some news attention from Batman Damned, where it's like Batman's, I forget the headline. Like the local news here in my area ran a story on that, and it was like uh, that it was some pun on Batarang that was just like that's it came out sounding way grosser than I think they intended. It's like Batman's used to throwing a Batarang, but now he's throwing around something else. It's like no, don't do that. Um, Every now and then you live in a market with a kind of a news station that likes comics, and those are always kind of funny. I remember there was a report on the Gwen Stacy is back to life and she's having sex with Norman Osborn, and it's like somebody covered that for no apparent reason, and it could only be there was like a slow news day, and somebody in that newsroom loved comics and somehow got that thing on the air. I'm trying to think. So what other ones? I know I'm forgetting some, but I'm not coming to it. I can't remember any other deaths that really got there. When Batman died at Final Crisis, I think there was a little bit of attention, but nothing really significant. Um, there was always a lot around like the X-Men cartoons and the X-Men movies where they do some report on something going on there, and in half the time they'd forget that there were even dimensions, there were comics. But in general, that's probably it. I'm gonna go with that's it, and then somebody in the comments going to remind me of a super super obvious one. It was funny, even when the Avengers quote unquote died with the onslaught and the Heroes Reborn stuff, that didn't get attention. That didn't get news attention. Not in any kind of significant way. I wouldn't be surprised if there was a market or two that covered that, but they it just wasn't the story that people thought it was. God, I could swear there was something else. Ah, well. Anyway, what have I forgot? Let me know in the comments below. And make me feel foolish. I know you want to. You'll get there. But let me know in the comments below what you think. Like, subscribe. I'm still thinking in the back of my head. I'm like, you're running out of time. You're wrapping up the video, and you're almost out of time to come up with that last thing that's super obvious that you're forgetting, but you're not going to get there. Anyway, hey, most importantly, thanks for listening.